Born Roque José Florencio in 1828. He was enslaved in Brazil and forced into the role of what was called a breeding slave, compelled to father more than 200 children over the course of his life. His story is not only about one man, but also about the hidden realities of slavery that shaped entire nations, communities, and generations. Today, we often hear about kings, generals, and presidents, but rarely do we hear about the everyday lives of those who endured unimaginable hardships and still managed to leave a legacy of resilience. Peter Seca, as he was known, is one of those forgotten figures whose life deserves to be remembered. When we speak of history, we usually think of dates, battles, or monuments. But history is also written in the lives of ordinary people whose existence carried both pain and hope, despair and determination. In the 19th century, Brazil relied on enslaved Africans to fuel its vast economy. Coffee, sugar, and cotton were not only commodities. They were produced by human beings who lived under constant oppression. After the international slave trade was banned in 1850, plantation owners turned inward. Instead of buying more enslaved people, they forced those already in bondage to reproduce, creating generations born into servitude. Peter Seca was singled out for his extraordinary physical stature, towering above most men, strong, and seen as the perfect candidate to expand the enslaved population. But while his body was controlled, his spirit was never fully broken. He taught his children survival skills, literacy, and resilience. He quietly resisted by preparing his descendants not just to survive, but to dream of freedom and dignity. In him we see both the cruelty of a system and the strength of an individual who found ways to leave an enduring impact. This story is more than just numbers and records. It is about memory. It is about what it means to pass down courage when everything else is stripped away. And it is about asking ourselves how many other voices have been lost in silence because their lives were never recorded. By telling the story of Peter Seca, we reclaim part of a history that should never be forgotten. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe history should shine light not only on those in power, but also on those who resisted, who endured, who dreamed, then stay with us. Together, we will explore not only the life of Peter Seca, but also the broader world of resistance, survival, and memory in Brazil's past. Before we continue, take a moment to support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it. You are helping keep these important stories alive. Your engagement ensures that voices once silenced can still be heard today. History is not only what we inherit, it is also what we choose to remember. And by choosing to remember Peter Seca, we honor all those who came before, whose struggles made our present possible. About 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were taken to Brazil, where slavery was not only the foundation of the economy but also a defining force that shaped culture, society, and identity for centuries, remaining in place until 1888 when Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish it. To understand the life of Peter Seca, one cannot separate his story from this broader backdrop, because the very system that sought to control him was built upon the labor, resilience, and suffering of millions of people who arrived in Brazil against their will. Imagine the scale of this reality: ships crossing the Atlantic, carrying men, women, and children who would never again see their homeland, deposited into ports that fed the growing plantations of sugar and coffee. These plantations were not merely businesses, they were empires of human labor, where wealth for a few was built on the lives of many. In such a world, every breath, every moment of life for those enslaved was dictated by the demands of production. The elite lived in opulence, often disconnected from the land itself, while enslaved Africans and their descendants transformed jungles and fields into fertile grounds for exports that would make Brazil a global economic power. Yet behind the wealth was an unspoken truth. It came at the expense of lives bent under the weight of endless labor. This was the world into which Peter Seca was born, a world where his body was not his own, where strength was viewed not as a gift but as a resource to be exploited, and where even the most personal aspects of life, such as family and intimacy, were weaponized to maintain the system. The fact that nearly half of the transatlantic slave trade ended in Brazil underscores just how central slavery was to the country's development. Unlike in some other parts of the Americas, where enslaved populations were smaller in proportion to the total population, in Brazil the majority of people in many regions were of African descent. This demographic weight gave rise not only to countless acts of resistance, but also to vibrant cultural expressions that have endured into the present. Music, food, religion, and language were reshaped in these crucibles of hardship, blending traditions from Africa with those imposed by colonial powers. Every drum beat, every whispered prayer in Yoruba or Kikongo, every shared story around a fire was an act of preservation, a refusal to let identity disappear in the shadow of forced servitude. And yet, despite this resilience, the system of slavery in Brazil was relentless in its demands. When the international slave trade was finally abolished in 1850, it did not mean the end of slavery itself, only a shift in how the labor force was sustained. Planters still needed workers for their fields, and without the constant inflow of new captives from Africa, the burden of reproduction fell upon those already enslaved. Enslaved women were pressured or forced to bear more children, while men considered physically strong and desirable were turned into breeding tools. Their humanity reduced to the number of offspring they could produce. This was the cruel machinery of survival for the slaveholding class. Children born into bondage were not celebrated as members of a family, but counted as future laborers, assets to be sold, rented, or used as replacements for those who perished under brutal conditions. Within this context, the story of Peter Seca takes on an even more striking dimension. He was not merely one man singled out because of his unusual height and strength. He was part of a calculated system designed to perpetuate slavery from within. His life cannot be understood in isolation, but must be seen as part of a deliberate strategy to maintain control over generations. The same system that forced him into fathering more than 200 children was the one that transformed Brazil into a nation whose economy was deeply rooted in bondage even as the rest of the world slowly turned away from such practices. His story is not simply about personal suffering, but about how entire populations were shaped by policies and practices that valued profit over humanity. Yet within this bleak reality, there were sparks of resistance, and they often began with individuals who, like Peter Seca, found ways to subvert the system in small but meaningful ways. By teaching his children to read, to fight, or simply to endure, he passed along more than just his physical presence. He gave them tools of survival that extended beyond the plantation. He lived during a period when revolts and quilombos communities formed by those who escaped flourished across Brazil, proving that even under the harshest conditions, people sought freedom and community. His life, therefore, becomes a lens through which we see not only the cruelty of the system, but also the determination of those who refuse to be broken by it. When we consider that slavery in Brazil lasted until 1888, decades after many other countries had already abolished it, we begin to understand the profound weight of this history. Generations were born and died under the same yoke, with little hope of legal freedom, and yet they carried within them traditions, stories, and strength that would eventually outlive the system that tried to erase them. Peter Seca's story, passed down through descendants and oral histories, is a testament to this endurance. He witnessed not just the persistence of slavery but also its end, living long enough to see Brazil declare abolition, long enough to watch the nation transform into a republic, and long enough to leave behind a lineage that still traces its roots to him. This larger backdrop of Brazil's role in the transatlantic slave trade, the sheer scale of the enslaved population, and the persistence of slavery longer than anywhere else in the Americas provides the necessary frame to understand why one man's story matters so deeply. It is not only about the extraordinary details of his life, but also about the millions of unnamed men, women, and children who lived under similar conditions, but whose names have been lost to history. By exploring the life of Peter Seca, we uncover more than just a personal narrative. We connect with the collective memory of a people whose strength shaped the Brazil we know today. After the international slave trade ended in 1850, slaveholders in Brazil faced a new challenge. For centuries, they had relied on the constant flow of ships crossing the Atlantic to replenish the labor force, bringing men, women, and children from Africa into bondage. But once the trade was officially abolished, the plantations still demanded workers, the crops still had to be harvested, and the wealth of the elite still depended on a steady supply of laborers. The solution they devised was not to ease the burden of those already enslaved, but to turn their very existence into a mechanism of reproduction. Enslaved men and women were forced into roles that stripped away the most intimate choices of life, transforming parenthood into a calculated system designed to maintain the plantation economy. Children were not welcomed into the world as sons or daughters to be cherished, but as property, as future workers, as investments whose lives would already be predetermined before they could even walk. This grim shift shaped the world into which Peter Seca's life unfolded. Born in 1828, he lived long enough to witness this transformation firsthand. When he was a young man, enslaved people were still being brought into Brazil from across the ocean. But as he grew older, the weight of sustaining the population fell increasingly upon those already trapped in bondage. For someone like him, with an extraordinary physical presence and strength, he became a target of this cruel logic. His tall frame, towering over others, and his endurance in the fields made him stand out in the eyes of slaveholders who viewed human lives in terms of utility and profit. They decided his body would serve a new role, not only in the endless cycle of labor, but also in creating more lives destined for servitude. To understand the depth of this reality, we must consider what it meant for enslaved people to have the most personal aspects of life dictated by force. Marriage, love, and family, things that form the core of human experience, were twisted into arrangements designed to maximize productivity. Relationships were often severed, partners separated, and children taken away without warning. Enslaved men and women were paired not out of affection, but out of the perceived advantage their union would bring to the plantation. The birth of a child, which should have been a moment of joy, was instead marked as the addition of another number in the slaveholder's ledger, another body to work the fields when the time came. For those who lived under this system, family bonds became both fragile and sacred, constantly threatened by sale or punishment, yet deeply cherished as the only source of humanity left to hold on to. It was within this environment that Peter Seca's story grew more complex. Singled out for his height and physical power, he was forced into fatherhood on a massive scale, reportedly becoming the father of more than 200 children. In the eyes of the masters, this made him invaluable, not only as a laborer but as a source of future labor. Yet in the eyes of his descendants, and in the memory preserved through oral histories, he was more than the role imposed upon him. He taught some of his children survival skills, instilled discipline, and passed on knowledge that could not be captured in the records of slaveholders. Even though the system sought to reduce him to nothing more than a body to be used, he resisted in the quiet ways that mattered by trying to prepare his children for a future beyond the chains that bound him. The cruelty of this practice was not unique to Brazil, but the scale was immense. With such a large proportion of the enslaved population, Brazil became a place where generations were born into slavery long after the international trade had ended. For the plantation elite, it was a system that ensured their wealth could continue without interruption. For the enslaved, it meant there was no reprieve, no light at the end of the tunnel. Only the knowledge that their children and grandchildren might face the same hardships unless something changed. Still, amid these conditions, families tried to hold on to fragments of normalcy. Songs were sung to lull babies to sleep, stories from Africa were told to keep memories alive, and secret gatherings were held to maintain a sense of identity. These small acts of resilience were ways to push back against a system designed to erase humanity. When abolition finally came in 1888, more than 3 centuries after slavery had first taken root in Brazil, it was too late to undo the suffering of millions. Pata Seca himself lived long enough to see this moment, his life stretching across an era that began with the height of the slave trade and ended with the official promise of freedom. By then, his children and grandchildren were scattered, some carrying his teachings, others bearing only the weight of the past. Yet his story remains powerful precisely because it reveals the dual nature of this history. On one side, the inhumanity of a system that reduced people to property, and on the other, the persistence of individuals who refused to let that system define their entire being. The forced reproduction of enslaved people was one of the darkest aspects of slavery in Brazil, and it explains why figures like Pata Seca are remembered with such complexity. He was both a victim of exploitation and a bearer of resilience, someone whose life was shaped by forces beyond his control but who still managed to leave a mark on generations. His story is a reminder that behind every statistic about slavery lies a human life, filled with contradictions, with suffering and strength, with loss and with endurance. By understanding what it meant for children to be treated as property, we also understand why memory matters, why these stories must be told, and why the legacy of people like Pata Seca continues to echo through history. Pata Seca was over 7 feet tall, strong, and charismatic, a man whose very presence seemed larger than life in a world that constantly tried to diminish him. His nickname, which translates to dry foot, carried with it an air of mystery that has endured long after his time. Some say it came from his unusual stride, others from his ability to move without leaving tracks. A legend whispered in the fields that suggested he could pass unseen even when under the watchful eye of those who sought to control him. In the collective memory of his descendants and community, the name became more than just a label. It was a symbol of his uniqueness, a reminder that even within the harsh confines of slavery, individuality could not be erased. To imagine a man like Pata Seca walking among the rows of sugarcane or coffee, towering over his peers, is to imagine someone who could not help but be noticed. His physical strength set him apart, and while this made him a target of exploitation, it also gave him a certain authority among those who shared his struggles. In the eyes of the slaveholders, his body was a resource, a machine of labor and reproduction, useful for the expansion of their wealth. But in the eyes of the enslaved community, his stature and charisma carried a different meaning. He was not just a tool. He was a figure who embodied resilience, someone whose very existence challenged the idea that slavery could strip away all dignity. The nickname Dry Foot grew into a story of its own. Legends often arise in times of oppression as ways of giving shape to hope. And in Pata Seca's case, the myth that he could walk without leaving tracks spoke to something deeper. It suggested that he could not be fully contained, that his spirit was untouchable even when his body was bound. To say he left no tracks was perhaps to say he could not be hunted down, that his movements could escape the eyes of those who thought they owned him. These tales may not have been literal, but they carried power, giving those who told them a sense of pride and inspiration in a world where so much was dictated by fear. The legend of his dry foot connected with the broader culture of storytelling among enslaved people. Oral traditions were essential, serving as a way to preserve identity, pass down lessons, and maintain hope. For children growing up in bondage, hearing about someone like Pata Seca, tall as a tree, strong as an ox, moving like a shadow, was to learn that strength could exist even in suffering, and that resistance could take many forms. These stories were not just entertainment. They were lifelines, holding communities together when everything else sought to tear them apart. His charisma added another layer to his presence. Those who remembered him spoke not only of his size, but also of his character. He was said to be disciplined, kind, and capable of teaching, in a world where slaveholders treated people as property. Pata Seca chose to treat his children and those around him as human beings, instilling in them values of resilience, survival, and pride. His legacy as a father went far beyond the hundreds of children he was forced to conceive. For the ones he could reach, he offered more than just his bloodline. He offered lessons, protection, and the spark of a vision for a life beyond the confines of bondage. In connecting this part of his story to the wider history, we see how his physical presence and the legends around his nickname intertwined with the reality of forced reproduction after the end of the international slave trade. His height and strength made him valuable to the slaveholders, who viewed his body as a source of future generations of laborers. Yet those same qualities gave him a symbolic power in the memory of his descendants. He was remembered not simply as someone used by the system, but as someone who carried himself with a kind of authority that the system could not completely take away. The nickname Dry Foot thus holds a dual meaning. To the slaveholders, it may have been a practical reference, something to mark him out as distinct. But to those who carried his memory, it became part of a mythos that spoke to survival, invisibility, and even resistance. The idea that he left no tracks was not just about his walk, but about the legacy he left behind. A legacy that endured despite the attempts of history to erase it. His descendants in São Carlos still remember him not as a faceless figure in a plantation record, but as a man whose presence shaped their community and whose story demands to be told. The physical details of Pata Seca, his towering height, his strength, his legendary nickname are not just curiosities. They are windows into how people under slavery created meaning, how they took what was imposed upon them and transformed it into something that could inspire. His story is inseparable from the broader context of slavery in Brazil. From the forced reproduction of enslaved people to the resilience of families who tried to hold on to humanity in the face of exploitation. But it is also personal, rooted in the unique qualities that made him stand out and the legends that turned him into something larger than life. By remembering Pata Seca as more than a statistic, more than just a victim of a cruel system, we honor the complexity of his life, his height, his strength, his nickname. All of these details remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were individuals whose presence could not be erased, whose footsteps, whether dry or hidden, still echo across generations. He fathered approximately 249 children, a number so vast that it is almost impossible to grasp. Yet in the small city of São Carlos, Brazil, this legacy is woven into the very fabric of its people. Generations later, many families still trace their roots back to him, whether through whispered family stories, faintly remembered traditions, or the rare but precious documents that survived the passage of time. To think of one man becoming the direct ancestor of such a large portion of a community is staggering. But in the case of Pata Seca, it is both a testament to his forced role in history and the way in which his memory has endured through those who refuse to let it be forgotten. The scale of his descendants' presence in São Carlos speaks to the cruel system that once reduced human beings to little more than tools of reproduction. Slaveholders saw Pata Seca's height, his strength, his charisma, and imagined only profit. They forced him into a role that robbed him of the choice to decide his own family, commanding him to father children with countless women, so that future generations of enslaved laborers could be born. To the enslavers, these children were not sons and daughters, not individuals with names, personalities, and futures, but commodities lives measured in their ability to work, serve, and be sold. But to Peter Seca, they were not faceless numbers. Even in the harshest conditions, he sought to give them guidance, to teach them skills, to remind them that they were more than what the system said they were. For the community that grew from his children and grandchildren, his presence became more than the forced legacy of a man used by others. It became a lineage of resilience, strength, and survival. His granddaughter, Maria Magdalena Florencio Florentino, understood the importance of keeping his memory alive. She held on to his death certificate and fragments of his story, passing them down like sacred relics that refused to let history erase his name. In her hands, a piece of paper became a shield against forgetting, a way to ensure that his story would remain in the collective memory of his descendants and beyond. Her determination is significant because history often fails to record the lives of those who lived in bondage. For centuries, official documents either omitted enslaved people entirely or reduced them to first names, numbers, or property records. For someone like Peter Seca, who lived more than a century and witnessed Brazil transform from an empire built on slavery into a republic seeking its modern identity, his story could easily have been lost to silence. But through the persistence of his descendants, fragments of his life still remain visible, allowing us to piece together the extraordinary journey of a man who should have been invisible to history, but instead became unforgettable. The fact that his granddaughter guarded his memory tells us much about the value of oral tradition and family legacy. In many Afro-Brazilian communities, stories became the archives that written history refused to keep. Around kitchen tables, at family gatherings, and in small towns like São Carlos, stories of ancestors like Peter Seca were told and retold, gaining strength with each generation. Children grew up hearing of the towering man who was called Dry Foot, who had fathered so many children that he became almost mythical, and who managed to live long enough to witness the abolition of slavery in 1888 and the dawn of a new century. These stories were not just tales of survival but acts of defiance against a past that tried to strip people of identity and worth. The number 249 children cannot be taken lightly. It speaks of both tragedy and endurance. On one hand, it reflects the cruel system that sought to use Peter Seca as a breeding tool, stripping him of autonomy and reducing his humanity to a function. On the other, it reflects the sheer magnitude of his presence in the lives of those who came after him. Each child carried within them not only the burden of being born into enslavement, but also the spark of a father who, despite the circumstances, attempted to give them fragments of knowledge and resilience that might help them navigate a world built against them. São Carlos itself bears the mark of this legacy. Walk through its neighborhoods and marketplaces, and chances are high that many of the people you meet carry a connection, however distant, to Peter Seca. His bloodline runs through the community like an underground river, shaping its present even as it recalls the pain of its past. For many, the knowledge that they are descended from him is both a source of pride and a reminder of the resilience of their ancestors. His story is not just about one man but about a community that grew despite unimaginable hardships, that found ways to thrive in the face of systemic oppression, and that carries forward the memory of survival as an inheritance. The preservation of documents like his death certificate is especially important. While oral traditions give life and soul to history, official records anchor them in the realm of recognized fact. They provide tangible proof to counter skepticism, to show that this man was real, that he lived, that he was not just a myth. For his granddaughter, holding that piece of history was not just about personal memory, but about reclaiming dignity for her family and her community. It was an assertion that their story belonged to the broader history of Brazil and deserved to be told alongside the stories of presidents, generals, and landowners. In remembering Pata Seca, we confront both the brutality of the past and the endurance of the human spirit. His 249 children symbolize the cruelty of forced breeding, yet they also represent the impossibility of erasing a people. His descendants are living proof that resilience can outlast oppression, that memory can survive even when history tries to silence it. His granddaughter's act of preservation ensures that his name and story continue to ripple outward, reminding us that behind every statistic of slavery was a human being with a face, a voice, and a legacy. Through him, we see the complexity of memory, how tragedy and pride intertwine, how pain and resilience shape identity. Pata Seca's life and legacy remind us that history is not just about what is written in books, but about what is carried in the hearts of those who refuse to let their ancestors be forgotten. His descendants in São Carlos are not merely living reminders of the past. They are living continuations of a story that began with a man forced into a role he did not choose, but who nevertheless became a figure of strength whose presence continues to shape the present. Despite the unbearable weight of exploitation and the constant reminders that he was seen as property rather than a man, Pata Seca still found ways to resist, not always with open confrontation, but through the quieter, more dangerous act of equipping his children with knowledge that could not be chained. In the dim light of nights on the plantation, or in hushed conversations away from the ears of overseers, he is said to have taught some of his children to read and write. Literacy, which was often forbidden to enslaved people, was a dangerous gift because the ability to understand words and ideas offered a pathway to resistance, to communication, and to envisioning life beyond the fields. Teaching them meant defying the very system that sought to keep them in ignorance. And in doing so, Pata Seca showed that survival was not just about enduring physically, but also about keeping the mind alive. But words alone were not enough in such a brutal world. Alongside literacy, he passed on lessons in fighting and survival, teaching his children how to defend themselves, how to move through the land, how to recognize danger and navigate it with strength and cunning. These were not lessons taught in the comfort of a classroom, but in the harsh reality of a life where physical resistance could mean the difference between captivity and freedom. In a society designed to strip enslaved people of power, he gave his children tools that allowed them to imagine themselves as more than victims. These skills, however simple or small, became seeds of empowerment that would take root in future generations. Oral histories tell us even more, that Pata Seca did not limit himself to passing on skills within the confines of the plantation. Stories from descendants and community traditions suggest that he played a part in rebellion, in organizing resistance, and in aiding quilombos, those remarkable communities of escaped slaves that sprang up across Brazil. Quilombos were havens of freedom, settlements carved out in forests and mountains where men, women, and children who had escaped slavery could rebuild their lives. They were places where African traditions blended with the reality of a new land, where autonomy was fiercely defended, and where freedom was not just a dream but a fragile, living reality. For someone like Pata Seca, whose size and strength were legendary, and whose spirit carried the weight of both survival and defiance, it is not hard to imagine that he would be drawn to these communities, offering his skills and courage to those who sought to break free. To lead or aid in rebellions was no small risk. Punishment for rebellion was brutal and merciless, often intended to serve as a warning to others. But the fact that oral traditions remember Pata Seca as a leader of revolts shows that his legacy was not simply that of a man forced into the role of fathering hundreds of children. He was also remembered as someone who stood against the very system that tried to define him. This duality, used as a tool of slavery yet remembered as a man of resistance, speaks to the complexity of his life and the strength of his character. It shows how individuals, even under the harshest conditions, could carve out moments of defiance that echoed far beyond their own lifetime. The connection between his acts of teaching and his involvement with rebellions is important, because both were forms of resistance. Literacy challenged the mental chains of slavery, while fighting skills challenged the physical ones. Supporting Quilombos offered a vision of freedom that extended beyond the plantation, showing his children and community that slavery was not the only possible reality. By embodying all these forms of resistance, Pata Seca became a figure whose life was not defined solely by what was taken from him, but also by what he chose to give to others. When we think back to the generations of his descendants in São Carlos, many of whom still carry his bloodline today, it is striking to realize that their heritage is not only one of forced breeding, but also one of survival strategies passed down through him. His teachings, both spoken and lived, would have carried through families, shaping the values of courage and resilience that helped them endure long after the formal abolition of slavery in 1888. In this way, his legacy is more than numbers or records. It is woven into the cultural fabric of the community, remembered in stories that continue to inspire. Oral histories are often dismissed by those who prefer written records. But in communities where official history erased or ignored the voices of the enslaved, oral tradition was the most powerful form of preservation. The stories of Pata Seca teaching his children to read, showing them how to fight, and leading revolts are not just fragments of folklore. They are affirmations of a man who refused to be reduced to silence. They remind us that history is not only found in archives, but also in the voices of families who refuse to let their ancestors be forgotten. Each retelling keeps his spirit alive, ensuring that his defiance continues to echo through time. What makes this part of his story so compelling is the way it fits into the broader narrative of Brazil's enslaved communities. Across the country, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from quiet acts of disobedience to full-scale revolts. Quilombos like palmares became legendary symbols of freedom, showing that resistance was not futile, that even in the darkest times, people could carve out spaces of independence. To link Pata Seca to these traditions is to place him within the lineage of those who refused to accept their fate passively, who fought for themselves and for others, and whose actions shaped the course of history even if their names were not written in official accounts. The image of a man who, despite being forced into unimaginable roles, still found the strength to teach, to fight, and to inspire rebellion is one that lingers powerfully. It shows us that the human spirit, even under the weight of oppression, finds ways to resist, to nurture, and to imagine freedom. Pata Seca's story, therefore, is not only about tragedy but also about agency, about the determination to pass on knowledge that could not be destroyed. His life is remembered not only for what he was forced to do but for what he chose to do, and in that choice lies his true legacy. Through his teachings and his defiance, he became more than a statistic, more than a breeding slave remembered for his children. He became a figure of resistance whose memory still inspires, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to fight for dignity and freedom. For his descendants and for all who learn his story, Pata Seca is not just a shadow from the past but a beacon of resilience, showing how knowledge, courage, and community could challenge the greatest injustices. As the years passed and the weight of time pressed upon him, Pata Seca's life entered a new chapter that revealed yet another side of his humanity, one that was not solely defined by the cruelty of the system he had endured but also by the deep bonds of love, family, and resilience that he was able to forge in spite of it. After a lifetime of being forced into roles that robbed him of choice, he finally experienced the rare gift of building something of his own, a union not imposed by plantation masters but chosen from the heart. It was then that he met Palmyra, a woman remembered as a healer, a figure of knowledge and care, whose presence brought balance and strength to his life. Their marriage marked more than a personal relationship. It was an act of reclaiming dignity, of asserting their right to love, to choose, and to create a family not for the benefit of others, but for themselves. Palmyra was more than a companion. She was a woman whose skills as a healer carried immense significance in a community where medical care was often inaccessible or withheld. Her knowledge, passed down through generations, was rooted in traditions that blended African heritage with the natural resources of Brazil, and it gave her the ability to treat ailments and provide comfort in a world where suffering was constant. To stand beside a man like Seca, whose immense stature and legendary reputation carried both reverence and burden, required courage and strength of her own. Together they formed a partnership that was remembered not simply because of who he was, but because of what they built together, something rooted in mutual respect, resilience, and hope. From their union came 9 children, a number far smaller than the hundreds he had been forced to father in earlier years. But each of these children carried a different meaning, for they were born into a family that was chosen, nurtured, and cherished. Unlike the children who had been marked as property from the moment of birth, these 9 grew up in an environment shaped not only by the harsh realities of the world outside, but also by the love and care of 2 parents who, despite the scars of their past, sought to carve out a space of humanity in the midst of cruelty. In this household, dignity became an inheritance, passed down not in words alone but in the very structure of daily life. The existence of this family became an act of quiet defiance against a society that had long attempted to strip enslaved people of identity and connection. Every moment Seca and Palmyra shared with their children, teaching them values, guiding them through stories, passing down survival skills and knowledge, was a testament to the fact that family bonds could survive even the harshest conditions. In the warmth of that home, shaped by the strength of a father who had known suffering and the healing hands of a mother who tended to both body and spirit, the children grew up with a sense of identity that transcended the limitations imposed by their world. Palmyra's role as a healer further enriched this legacy. In communities where illness was common and resources were scarce, her ability to treat wounds, ease pain, and offer remedies provided more than physical relief. It reinforced the sense of unity and resilience among those around her. For their children, it meant being raised not only by a father who embodied strength and resistance, but also by a mother who embodied wisdom, compassion, and care. Together, their influence created a foundation strong enough to withstand the weight of history. For Seca, who had lived through decades of exploitation, the experience of building this family with Palmyra allowed him to reclaim a sense of self that the system had tried to erase. He was no longer just the man remembered for his extraordinary height or for the children he was forced to father. He was also a husband, a father of choice, and a partner who shared in the work of nurturing life and protecting dignity. This transformation showed that even those who had been denied agency for much of their lives could still find ways to assert it, to shape their own stories, and to pass down something meaningful to the generations that followed. The story of their marriage and their 9 children is not just a footnote in the larger narrative of slavery in Brazil. It is a reminder that humanity persisted even in places designed to crush it. It shows that love, care, and the creation of family bonds could flourish even in the harshest conditions, offering hope and inspiration not only to their descendants but to anyone who hears their story today. In remembering this part of Seca's life, we see that his legacy was not only one of resistance and survival but also one of healing, dignity, and the quiet power of choosing to build a life that reflected his humanity. The presence of Palmyra in his story is essential, because she represents the balance to his strength. Where he was remembered for his towering figure, his charisma, and his defiance, she brought the wisdom of care, the resilience of tradition, and the healing touch that held their family together. Together, they were more than individuals shaped by the system of slavery. They became symbols of the ways in which people reclaimed their lives, piece by piece, despite the world's attempts to take everything from them. In the memory of their descendants, this chapter of their lives is remembered with pride, for it demonstrates that even after generations of hardship, the pursuit of dignity, love, and family never disappeared. Instead, it survived through people like Seca and Palmyra, who showed that humanity could endure even when everything else seemed uncertain. Their marriage, their children, and their shared life stand as a lasting testament to resilience, not only reminding us of the cruelty of the past, but also offering a vision of hope for the future. Living through more than a century, Seca's story stretched far beyond the confines of his early years of bondage, weaving itself into the very fabric of Brazil's transformation as a nation. Oral traditions claim that he reached the extraordinary age of 130, a lifespan so rare that it almost seems mythical, and yet it fits the larger-than-life aura that surrounded him. His existence, already marked by strength, resistance, and resilience, took on an even greater depth as he bore witness to the sweeping changes that reshaped the land he had been born into as an enslaved man. His life bridged eras, carrying him from a Brazil still entrenched in the brutality of colonial systems to a republic forging its identity on the world stage. Through his eyes, one could glimpse the struggles, triumphs, and contradictions of a country wrestling with its past while stepping hesitantly toward the future. To imagine him in his later years is to picture a man who had once been forced into roles that denied his humanity, now sitting with descendants and neighbors, his towering figure aged but unbroken, his voice heavy with the authority of someone who had seen too much to be silenced. Born into slavery when Brazil was still under the influence of its colonial rulers, he lived to see the abolition of the institution that had defined his youth and stolen much of his freedom. The Lei, signed in 1888, was a milestone not just for the nation but also for someone like Seca, who had endured its harshest realities. For him, freedom came late, but it came nonetheless, and he lived to experience the world reshaped by that monumental shift. He carried in his memory the weight of those who had not lived to see the day, making his survival and longevity a form of living testimony to their struggles. But his life did not end with abolition. Instead, he lived on as Brazil transformed from empire to republic, through revolutions and political upheavals that sought to define what the new nation would become. Each change in power, each uprising, each struggle for a more just or more stable system would have been observed by a man who had endured a time when even the concept of citizenship was denied to him. For someone like Seca, who had once been counted as property, the evolution of Brazil's identity as a republic must have been both strange and profound, a reminder that while laws and governments shifted, the memories of what had been endured could never be erased. As the decades unfolded, wars broke out, reshaping not only the political map but also the daily lives of ordinary people. He lived through conflicts that tested the nation's resilience, each one another reminder that freedom and peace were never guaranteed. Oral histories suggest that in these years, he became a figure of wisdom within his community, someone whose perspective was invaluable because it spanned so many eras. His presence was a living connection to a past that many preferred to forget. But that could not be erased as long as he remained alive to recount it. What makes his longevity even more remarkable is that it allowed him to live into a Brazil that was no longer only defined by its past of slavery and colonial exploitation, but one that had begun to take its place in global culture. To imagine him alive during the 1950 FIFA World Cup is to understand just how vast his lifetime was. From the days when Africans were brought across the ocean in chains to the moment when Brazil, as a free nation, hosted one of the most celebrated events in modern sport, Pater Seca's life encompassed a transformation few could ever have envisioned. For his descendants, this connection was extraordinary. To know that their ancestor had lived to see such a moment must have reinforced the sense that his life carried not only tragedy and struggle but also endurance and pride. The oral traditions that surround him often blur the line between fact and legend. And perhaps that is fitting, because a man who survived so much and lived so long deserves to be remembered in ways that transcend the ordinary. His story is not simply about the length of his years, but about the depth of what he carried within them. Every wrinkle on his face, every scar on his body, and every word he spoke in his later years would have been marked by the journey from slavery to freedom, from silence to legacy, from suffering to remembrance. In the final chapters of his life, Pater Seca became more than just an ancestor. He became a symbol, a keeper of memory, a bridge between generations who might otherwise have been cut off from their history. His marriage to Palmyra, his role as a father and teacher, his reputation as both survivor and resistor, all of these elements combined to create a legacy that was still alive in his presence well into the 20th century. Children and grandchildren could sit at his feet and hear firsthand about a world that seemed impossibly distant, a world they knew only through his stories. His life thus served as a form of oral history, keeping alive truths that official narratives often tried to erase. His extraordinary longevity also meant that he witnessed contradictions that defined Brazil in the modern age. He saw a nation that abolished slavery but still carried its scars, that became a republic but continued to struggle with inequality, that rose on the global stage but had yet to fully confront the legacies of its past. His very existence in those years was a reminder that history was not as distant as people might like to believe. To look into his eyes was to see both the wounds of the past and the endurance of the human spirit. The image of Pater Seca in his final years, aged yet strong in memory, represents the culmination of a life that defied the boundaries of time. He lived long enough to witness the rise and fall of empires, the signing of abolition, the reshaping of nations, and even the celebrations of modern sport that symbolized unity on a global scale. In doing, he became more than a man, he became a living archive, a testament to survival, and a symbol of how far Brazil had come and how far it still had to go. His story, stretching across more than a century, remains one of the most remarkable legacies of endurance, transformation, and the unbreakable will to live. In the midst of a life marked by exploitation, resistance, and extraordinary longevity, there were also moments that revealed the complexity of Pater Seca's position within the world he inhabited. Unlike many who were forced to endure the harshest conditions of slavery in Brazil, he occupied a place that allowed him certain privileges, though they came not from freedom but from the peculiar role imposed upon him. He lived in the main house, a space closer to the center of power and comfort than the quarters where most enslaved people were confined. This proximity meant he had access to better food, more stable shelter, and an environment where the brutal physical toll of fieldwork did not define his everyday. Yet these privileges, though they set him apart, were not gifts freely given but rather part of the system that sought to use him in a different way, and they came with their own set of burdens. Within that main house, Pater Seca became a figure both respected and remembered, not only for his physical presence but also for the way he carried himself. Oral traditions recall that he practiced religion with dedication, finding in faith a source of strength and meaning that endured through decades of change. Religion, for him, was not simply ritual. It was a connection to something greater than the confines of his life, a way to make sense of suffering and to preserve dignity when so much was denied. His devotion became part of how he was remembered, not as a passive follower but as someone who lived his beliefs with discipline and integrity. The gatherings he hosted further deepened his legacy. These were not grand celebrations in the style of the wealthy but gatherings rooted in community. Spaces where stories could be shared, traditions passed down, and humanity affirmed. To bring people together under his roof was to offer more than food and company. It was to create a sense of belonging in a society that had tried so hard to sever connections and strip away identity. In those moments, he transformed the space he had been given into one that served not only himself, but those around him, shaping it into a place of warmth and memory. Kindness became another of his defining qualities. And it is striking that this is what descendants and communities remember most vividly about him. To be kind in a world of cruelty was an act of resistance in itself, a way of demonstrating that humanity could not be erased even under the harshest systems. His kindness was not weakness but strength, born of the understanding that dignity could be preserved through compassion. It was paired with discipline, another trait that defined his character and allowed him to navigate the challenges of a life that spanned slavery, freedom, and beyond. Discipline gave him the resilience to endure and the clarity to guide others, while kindness gave him the ability to connect, to heal, and to inspire trust. Together, these qualities made him a man who could be respected not just for his size or his legend, but for the moral authority he embodied. When viewed in the context of his entire life, these details enrich the picture of who Seca was. He was not only the towering figure forced into fathering hundreds of children, nor solely the rebel remembered for teaching literacy and survival skills, nor just the man who lived to witness the abolition of slavery and the rise of modern Brazil. He was also a man who found ways to create spaces of community, who brought faith into his daily life, and who ensured that kindness and discipline were part of his legacy. In a society that tried to strip enslaved people of individuality, these traits became markers of identity, proof that he could not be reduced to a role imposed upon him. Living in the main house gave him a unique vantage point, bridging the world of the enslaved and the world of the enslavers. He witnessed the contradictions of a system that gave him privileges while still denying his freedom. And he used that position not for selfish gain but to foster connection, to share knowledge, and to preserve humanity. His ability to walk this delicate line without losing sight of who he was speaks to a strength that went beyond physical power. It was a strength of spirit, one that allowed him to endure not only as a survivor but as someone remembered for the positive impact he had on those around him. In later years, as he became a figure of oral history and legend, these aspects of his life became even more important. Descendants did not only remember him as an exploited man or as a symbol of resistance, but as someone who embodied values that could be carried forward. His discipline inspired respect. His kindness offered a model of humanity. His gatherings kept traditions alive, and his faith provided hope. These qualities, when passed down through stories, became part of the cultural inheritance of his community, ensuring that he would not be remembered solely in terms of what was done to him, but also in terms of what he gave. His story thus demonstrates that survival was not just about endurance, but also about the choices made in the midst of suffering. To live with kindness, to practice faith, to bring people together, and to maintain discipline were choices that carried meaning and power. They allowed Seca to reclaim agency in a life where so much had been taken from him. And in those choices, his humanity shines most brightly. By the time he reached the remarkable age of 130, Seca's life had already encompassed nearly every imaginable hardship and transformation. Yet what endured in the memories of those who knew him was not only his height, his strength, or his role in history, but the way he lived day by day with dignity, with kindness, and with the discipline that carried him across generations. His presence in the main house, his role as a host and a man of faith, and his legacy of compassion all remind us that even in the harshest systems, individuals could find ways to assert their humanity and leave behind a story that would inspire for centuries to come. Much of what we know about Peter Seca does not come from pages in official archives or government records, because men like him were rarely considered worthy of documentation in the eyes of those who controlled power at the time. Instead, his life has been carried forward through the voices of his descendants and the oral traditions of his community. Stories of his strength, his immense height, his resilience, his defiance, and his kindness have been preserved not by ink on paper but by memory, passed from one generation to another. This itself is a profound reminder of how history works. What is written down often reflects the priorities of those in power, while what is spoken and remembered reflects the truths of those who lived it. In this way, the life of Peter Seca embodies two sides of history: the cruelty of slavery and the endurance of human dignity. On one hand, his story shows us how deeply dehumanizing the institution was, reducing individuals to their physical attributes and forcing them into roles that denied them basic autonomy, to be treated as a breeding slave, valued only for the ability to produce children who would themselves be born into bondage, reveals the brutality of a system designed to strip away identity, love, and freedom. It is painful to imagine, and even more painful to accept, that this was not a rare occurrence, but a deliberate practice that sustained economies for centuries. Yet at the same time, his story is also about resilience. Despite the exploitation, despite the lack of freedom, despite being remembered more for what was done to him than what he chose, Peter Seca managed to carve out moments of resistance and humanity. He taught his children to read and to fight. He is remembered as someone who joined or even led rebellions, and who offered guidance to quilombos, those havens of freedom built by escaped enslaved people in remote corners of Brazil. He married Palma and built a family grounded in love and dignity, showing that even under impossible circumstances, enslaved people found ways to hold on to their humanity. His incredible longevity, living reportedly to the age of 130, became a metaphor in itself. He was alive to see Brazil change from a colony dependent on forced labor to a republic grappling with modern identity. He witnessed the abolition of slavery in 1888, a moment that marked the end of one era but did not erase its legacies. He lived through wars, revolutions, and even moments of joy like Brazil's participation in the 1950 FIFA World Cup. His long life was like a bridge connecting centuries, bearing witness to both the darkness of the past and the possibilities of the future. When we reflect on his story today, we are invited to see both the pain and the power of memory. We are reminded that history is not just about leaders, rulers, and official decrees, but about individuals whose lives carried meaning far beyond the roles imposed upon them. Peter Seca was more than a breeding slave. He was a father, a leader, a man of faith, and a symbol of resilience. The fact that his story survives today is a testament to the strength of oral tradition, to families who refused to let his memory be erased, and to communities that recognized his importance even when official history did not. For us, his life is not only a history lesson but also a call to reflection. It challenges us to acknowledge the brutality of slavery without looking away, but it also calls us to recognize the resilience that shines through even in the darkest times. It is a reminder that dignity can be preserved in ways that transcend oppression, and that the human spirit has a capacity to endure and inspire long after the systems of exploitation have crumbled. And so, as we bring this story to a close, let us carry forward the lessons it offers. Let us remember that history is not just something in the past, but something that shapes the present. The descendants of Peter Seca still walk among us, carrying his legacy in their blood and in their memories. His life challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths while also encouraging us to find strength in resilience, compassion, and community. If you have found meaning in this story, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. By doing, you help ensure that stories like these continue to be told, that voices once silenced are amplified, and that the resilience of people like Pata Seca is never forgotten. Your support makes it possible to bring forward more hidden histories, more stories that remind us of both the fragility and the strength of humanity. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to reflect, and to carry this story with you. May it serve as a reminder of the importance of memory, of the dangers of forgetting, and of the power of resilience. Wherever you are, I hope you find peace, rest, and inspiration in knowing that even in the harshest of times, individuals like Pata Seca showed the world that dignity could never be completely taken away. Good night, and may you rest well with the knowledge that remembering the past is one of the most powerful ways to honor those who endured it and to build a future rooted in justice, compassion, and truth.